we got this document from one of you, and wow, it really got us thinking.
Yeah.
It's called The Covetous Nature of the Social Welfare Systems.
Mm.
And it kind of looks at something we all kind of take for granted, like how we live together in a society.
Right.
So in this deep dive, we really want to unpack the core of what this argument is. And it's looking at social welfare through a really interesting and unexpected lens, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this piece is really trying to draw that direct connection between, those support systems that we have in place and this idea of covetousness, which, really gets at that kind of strong desire for what belongs to others. And It really does challenge, I think, some assumptions that we all carry about how society should be caring for its people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the author kicks things off with like a really direct question. And it's one of those that you just can't ignore.
Right.
It says, what if I told you that the system we live in has integrated a covetous practice, and you, as a willing participant, are living a covetous lifestyle? And it's like, oh, okay, wait a minute, let me examine this.
Yeah.
So let's get right into it. How does this document define covetousness?
Well, the document is very specific. It says that covetousness, in this sense, it's not just wanting things in general.
Right.
It's to desire what others have, ignited by jealousy, selfishness, and discontentment.
Wow.
And the real key part here is that it's really about wanting what someone else already possesses.
Yeah. So it's not just aspiration, like you said.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, you have that, and I want that.
Right.
Now, the author gives these scenarios to kind of illustrate the point, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through those scenarios?
Sure. So the first scenario, it's pretty straightforward. Imagine, going to your neighbor and just straight up demanding they pay for something you need.
Okay.
And, the author suggests that, I think most people would agree with this, that action is pretty much the definition of coveting.
Yeah. I mean, you're taking something or trying to from someone else.
Exactly. You're trying to get something that belongs to someone else, right?
Right.
And it's very clearly stepping over the line of personal boundaries and, what people own.
Right. There's no debate there.
No debate there. But then the author presents a scenario that's a little less direct.
Okay.
What if instead of demanding it yourself, you send someone else to do it for you?
Oh, interesting.
And the argument here is that even though you're not the one, with your hand out,
right,
the desire is still there, right? You still want what your neighbor has.
It's like delegating the action, but you still have the intention.
Exactly. You can't really escape the responsibility just by using a middleman.
Okay, got it. So now we get to scenario number 3, and this is where I think it really starts to challenge how we think about modern society.
Yeah, definitely. So this scenario describes a system where, as citizens, we elect officials, and then those officials, they make laws that require us to pay money, through taxes.
Right.
And then they use that money to fund various programs and services. But the key point the author is making here is that if someone refuses to pay, or they can't pay these required contributions, then they face legal consequences.
Right.
They could lose property, they could face other penalties. And this is where the author anticipates the arguments that a lot of people make in favor of this system.
And those are we consent to this because we vote.
Exactly. We vote for these people.
And we all contribute, so we all have a right to receive benefits.
Yeah. It's this idea of collective contribution and participation.
Right.
But the author's arguing that even with all of that, this system still, at its core, involves desiring and taking resources from others.
Wow, that's a really different way to look at it.
It is. It's asking us to think about whether this legally sanctioned and structured system, might still be a form of covetousness.
So the author introduces this idea that we don't really have a choice, that we're kind of born into this system of force. Well, what does that mean?
Well, they're basically saying that since we're born into a society where these systems are already in place, funded by these mandatory contributions, our participation isn't truly an act of free will.
Right.
It's the reality we've always known.
We're not really presented with a choice. We just kind of fall into it.
Right. And the author suggests that there's this kind of unspoken trade-off happening where we're giving up some of our individual freedom in exchange for the security and the provision of needs that the system offers.
So the consent we give might not be fully voluntary because it's the only option we've ever known.
Exactly. And this leads into a really interesting section where the author outlines what they see as the negative side effects of what they call forced charity.
And it is a pretty critical take. So let's dive into that list.
Okay, so the first one is that we end up giving our power away to man who lord over us. And what the author seems to be implying here is that these systems, by their very nature, they concentrate power in the hands of the government and those who run these programs.
And that can lead to a sense of like, well, I don't really have any power anymore.
Exactly. Like you have less control over your own resources and your own life.
Okay, so what's the next negative effect that the author talks about?
Well, the author argues that when giving becomes mandatory, like through taxes, it actually weakens our muscles of charity.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's like when we're forced to provide for others, our natural inclination to give freely just out of the goodness of our hearts, it actually diminishes.
So it's almost like, why should I give extra if I'm already being forced to give?
Right. And it raises questions about how these systems might actually impact individual generosity.
Okay, what else? What other negative consequences does the author see?
The author says, and this is a pretty strong statement, that we end up biting one another in the name of the benefit of all.
Oh.
And what this seems to be getting at is the potential for conflict and division that can happen when resources are being redistributed.
Yeah.
You know, some groups might feel like they're putting in more than they're getting back, or that the system is unfair.
So you're saying it's almost like trying to create unity can actually create more division.
Right. And then the author takes it even further with the next point, saying that the system ultimately leads to the destruction of family, community, and nations because of this system of bondage.
Wow, that's a huge statement.
It is. And what they seem to be saying is that when the state becomes responsible for taking care of people's needs, it actually weakens the traditional support networks that exist within families and communities.
So it's like everyone becomes more dependent on the state and less dependent on each other.
Exactly. And the list goes on.
Okay, what's next?
Well, the author also points to the fact that we're giving up our rights and free will in the name of security and guarantees. And this kind of echoes that earlier point about the trade-off, right? Yeah. Where we're giving up some personal autonomy in exchange for the promise of safety.
It's like the state is giving us security, but at the same time, they're taking more control.
Right. And finally, the author brings up a concern that a lot of people have about large-scale programs, which is rising cost of living because of the mismanagement and market manipulation of those elected.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before.
It's a critique of the efficiency of these programs and how they might actually contribute to things like inflation.
Okay, so that's a very critical view of the potential downsides. Now, the document also gets into religious and ethical considerations, and it draws specifically from Christian teachings.
Yes.
What are some of the key points there?
Well, one central question that the author raises is whether social welfare systems with their structure of authority, and the ability to enforce contributions, whether they actually resemble the worldly governments that Christ cautioned his followers against.
Right, like the ones that lord over one another.
Exactly. So they're drawing a parallel between the power dynamics of these state-run systems and a form of governance that Christian teachings might discourage.
Okay, what other connections to Christian principles does the author make?
The author emphasizes the teaching to love our neighbor as ourselves, and they connect that to the idea of sharing resources voluntarily out of love and compassion.
Not because you're forced to.
Right. And they give the example of being willing to share a tunic when we have two and our neighbor has none.
So it's more about personal acts of generosity, not this impersonal system of redistribution.
Exactly. And this ties into another point the author makes, which is about Christ's emphasis on giving with a charitable heart, not by obligation or pressure.
Right.
And this really challenges the idea of forced taxation as a genuine expression of charity.
It's saying that it's not real charity if you're forced to do it.
Right. It's about the motivation behind the giving.
Okay, what else?
Well, the author also raises this interesting question about whether people have come to see the government as their primary provider. Like, have we replaced reliance on God with reliance on the state?
And by doing that, we're kind of giving up our free will.
Exactly. We become dependent on the system instead of on God.
So that gets into, like, ideas of self-reliance.
Yeah.
And where do we place our trust?
Right. And then finally, the author addresses this idea that, well, even if the means are bad, the ends justify the means. You know, we're doing this for good reasons.
Right.
But the author rejects that completely. They say that you can't justify evil means,
Okay.
even if the goal is a good one.
So they're saying that forced taxation is inherently wrong,
Right.
regardless of what it's used for.
Exactly. And this leads into the author's alternative vision, which they call the way of God's kingdom.
Okay, so how does this document describe that alternative?
Well, the author suggests that we should rely on divine providence.
Mm-hmm.
They say that if we live according to God's wisdom, our needs will be met through his provision.
So there's a system of support that's based on faith, not on the state.
Right. And the author also warns against trying to compromise between this divine way and worldly systems.
What do they mean by that?
They're basically saying that if we try to mix those two things, it'll weaken our spiritual commitment.
So it's all or nothing.
Yeah, they're calling for complete dedication to God's path.
Okay, and how do we start moving towards this way of God's kingdom? Where do we begin?
The author says that it all starts with loving your neighbor as yourself.
Okay.
And letting that love guide how we interact with each other and how we share resources.
So it's more about individuals changing their hearts
Mm-hmm.
than it is about changing the system.
Right. It's a grassroots approach. And the author does mention that there would still be some kind of structure or organization within this government of God.
Okay.
But they don't really go into detail about what that would look like.
So it's more about the principles than the specifics.
Exactly. And finally, the author connects all of this to the bigger question of the meaning of life.
That's a big one.
Yeah, they say that our souls are hungry and thirsty for the narrow path of God's way.
Mm-hmm.
And they imply that following this path is the only way to find true meaning and purpose.
So it's not just about how society functions, but about our own spiritual journeys.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into a very challenging perspective.
It has.
Just to kind of recap, the main argument here is that participating in social welfare systems, the way they're set up now with mandatory contributions, can be seen as a form of covetousness.
Right. And it really forces us to examine the ethics of how we take care of each other as a society.
Absolutely. And it really challenges those common assumptions that we have about social safety nets.
Yes, it does. And it's important for you, the listener, to remember that we're not trying to tell you what to think. We're just presenting the ideas that are in this document and letting you decide what you make of them.
So, after hearing all of this, what do you think about this balance between collective responsibility and individual charity?
Yeah, good question.
Is it covetous to rely on a system that takes from some and gives to others? And what about the ethical implications of how these systems are structured?
Lots to think about.
It's a lot to think about, and this document definitely gives us a different lens to view it through.
It does.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.